2017, we have a distinguished presenter today, Dr. Samuel Bowles from the Santa Fe Institute. He's a research professor and heads the behavioral science program there. He has also taught economics at Harvard from 1965 to 1973, and thereafter at the University of Massachusetts, also in economics, where he's now an emeritus professor, and he teaches economics at the University of Siena. This did not, however, stop E.O. Wilson from referring to Sam Bowles as one of our illustrious biologists, evolutionary biologists. Why he did that in his most recent book, The Social Conquest of Earth, is just speaks to the breadth of Sam's work. More evidence, he's published in Science and Nature, The New Scientist, the American Economic Review. Those first three journals have much higher impact indices, I have to say, relative to economics. Theoretical Population Biology, Games in Economic Behavior. The list just goes on and on. Public Affairs, Current Anthropology, Journal of Economic Perspectives, which many of the students will recognize. His most recent book is The Moral Economy, Why Good Laws Are No Substitute for Good Citizens. Other recent books include A Cooperative Species, Human Reciprocity and Its Evolution. Connection to biology again. That's with Herbert Gentis, published by Princeton University Press. Two important achievements on the practical side are in his column. The first is he served as an economic advisor to the governments of Cuba, South Africa, and Greece. But before you start reflecting on the economic performance of those particular countries, keep in mind that the presence of doctors is highly correlated with disease. It is not, however, causal of disease. He also is involved in a big project now called CORE, Curriculum Open Access Resources for Economics. This is a textbook written from the perspective of computational economics, behavioral economics. This is all the new approaches that are in the field, and that will be coming out in 2018.
It's out.
It's out. Now, I know for a fact that Sam could give this talk without references, without notes, without slides, or anything else. I've seen him do it when he was at the University of Massachusetts. You're really in for a treat. Sit back and enjoy it.
Thanks very much, Bill. Thanks for that introduction, and thank all of you for coming. I'm not sure you're in for a treat because, as I told Bill, going over this lecture the past couple of days working on it, this is a difficult lecture, and it's going to challenge you. And I don't just mean those of you in economics. It's hard, and it's important. But I want to say that at the beginning because I don't expect everything to be immediately apparent to you. Why do I start with these pictures here? Well, I'm going to cover a lot of history and prehistory, from when human beings were hunters and gatherers, and this was our livelihood, to when we made a transition to farming, industry, and this is a depiction of the World Wide Web. I'm going to ask the question, in this condition here, we were basically pretty egalitarian. Among families, there were very few differences in wealth or in income or in standing or in actually political power. When we made a transition to farming, things changed rather radically here. And then I want to ask, what about the future? What about the economy, which is based on the transfer of information? That's roughly what I'm going to be talking about. But I first want to tell you why I'm giving you this lecture. And the answer is very simple. That's unjust. That is a depiction of injustice. There's no way that you could justify the juxtaposition of the luxury and the poverty in São Paulo, Brazil. And you can get pictures like that anywhere where I've traveled in the world. This is not atypical. It's a rather striking photograph, I have to admit. Now, I confronted questions like this when I was 11. 1951, forget about the 68. I attended this school in India. As you can see, there were no buildings, just tents. Me and my two sisters were the only kids in the school of 2,000 kids who were not Indian. And after a couple of months there, I asked my mom a question. I said, why are the Indian people so poor? I mean, I was so struck by that. That's obvious, you could see it. But I was also struck by the fact that I was extraordinarily average in that school. I was not particularly good at the academic stuff. I had attended a four-room elementary school in my hometown, and I wasn't particularly good in sports. So I asked the obvious question, how come they're so poor when we're all the same? That question has stuck with me. I mean, think about it. We are all pretty much the same around the world, and that some peoples, on average, are 20 times as well off as the others. Have you seen me in the picture? Have you figured out which one is me? Look for the white legs. There you go. And notice also, I'm a lot bigger than them, so the fact that I wasn't better in sports was really kind of embarrassing. So I had to deal with this question, and it stuck with me, and it's probably one of the reasons why I decided to go into economics. This is why I'm here talking about this. This is why I've spent my life studying inequality and trying to figure out what we could do about it. Now, the topic for today is at the top. I want to ask you, what can we learn about the future of inequality by studying and understanding better the conditions under which inequality became the human condition? It wasn't always that way. Through most of our life on this planet, it has not been that we've been highly unequal. It started maybe 11,000 years ago with the beginning of farming. And then shortly after that, 2 or 3 millennia after that, with the advent of governments and states. You see a big increase in the amount of inequality. I'll show you some evidence for that. Now, if we could understand this, we might be able to understand better what the prospects are for the future of inequality and injustice in our world today, because our economy is changing a lot now. It's changing in ways that should allow us to predict something for the conditions under which inequality might persist or might actually become less. So we have to ask, what conditions made it possible for this rather egalitarian ape, namely humans, to turn into a highly hierarchical and unequal species, with some people dominating others and having much more access to goods and services? I think there were 3 conditions that made it possible. And you can see exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to say, what made it possible then? And then I'm going to ask, are those conditions likely to hold in the future? Well, the first is that the wealth of a forager, hunter-gatherer, is basically his or her strength and intelligence and ability to cooperate with others and networks. It had nothing to do, literally nothing to do, with the material wealth they might have had. In fact, they had very little material wealth other than their weapons and some ornaments and so on. But the wealth of farmers was quite different. Material wealth was very important among farmers, and it could be owned. You could fence it, you could inherit it, and most of all, you could accumulate it. You could get a whole lot of it in one generation, pass it on to your kids, and they could get even more. So the nature of the wealth itself allowed inequality to become very substantial. I call this the economic condition for the emergence of inequality as part of the human condition. But there's also now a political condition, and that is, given that we have all this inequality in material wealth, it had to be the case that the people who owned that stuff actually got to keep the income. It was theirs. It wasn't going to be taken by somebody else in taxation or in theft or anything else. They had secure property rights in that stuff, whether it's land or cattle or industrial capital or anything else. That's the political condition. The third condition is societies that were organized in a very unequal way did very well. With the advent of capitalism, the highly unequal societies, Europe and the European offshoots, were structured in ways that both supported a lot of inequality, but also which was associated with military and demographic and other advantages, which allowed them to outcompete other societies in the world and eventually to dominate most of the world in the 18th and 19th and first half of the 20th century. So these very unequal societies did well, and therefore they survived. That's the third condition. Now, as I said, this is my strategy. I'm now going to ask, Are we likely to see those conditions in the future? The first condition, I'm repeating it here, that's the economic condition. Let's think about the future economy. The future economy is going to involve a lot of services. In fact, most of what we do in an economy today is not producing things. It's taking care of each other. It's producing knowledge. It's producing affect, cultural effects and affects. It's providing the complement to leisure time, the things that go along with recreation and so on. Now, this is what's called, in the literature, it's called the weightless economy. And it's called weightless because you can't weigh it, you can't measure it, you can't fence it. The stuff that's really important there is not something that you can own. It's something you do, it's a capacity that you have. Now, the key input in the economy of the future is going to be human capacities. Our networking, the things we can do, is sometimes called human capital, human resources. I call it human capacities. Now, these forms of wealth, human wealth, the ability to do things and to connect with people and to cooperate, that stuff is very hard to get a whole lot of in one person. And by the way, it's very hard to pass it on to your kids. That may surprise you. I'll give you some evidence for that. The stuff that makes people richer or better off in a society in which human capital is really the main thing, that stuff doesn't get passed on to kids anywhere near to the extent that cows and land and industrial capital does. So the economic condition for inequality may not hold in the future, or it may not hold to the extent that it has in the past. Now, when we come to the political condition, I'm just repeating it at the top of the slide, let's think about what happened over the last 300 or 400 years. In the past, over that period, there evolved a system of government. It's called liberal democracy. That means the respect for individual rights, fair elections in which those who lose elections leave office, and so on. I think you know the idea of that. That system, democracy or liberal democracy, emerged because it was the price that the elite had to pay in order to keep the stability of the system. They had to essentially give rights to people, or otherwise there would have been a revolutionary upheaval, as indeed there were in many places that didn't become liberal democracies, like Russia, like China, Vietnam, and so on. Now, this democratic system has not abrogated the property rights of the rich, but it has in many places substantially encroached on the income flows through taxation. So that, for example, in some societies, government taxation will make up half of the GDP. So that basically has to do with a huge amount of redistribution of the income associated with the highly unequally held assets of the rich. Now, this, what I call redistributive encroachment, I'm talking about taxes, basically, it's been limited to some extent because financial wealth, that is, the ownership of assets, is mobile. And you can leave. The threat of closing the firm here and going someplace else puts a damper on how much you can tax that company. And it's also probably, I think it's a true argument to say, if the taxation is introduced in such a way that it substantially lowers the after-tax profit rate, that will actually hurt the economy because of the fact they don't have to invest. You can't force them to invest. You can't even force them to stick around. And so that's put a limit on how much we can actually tax and redistribute income. Now, these limits on redistribution may be less constraining in the weightless economy. Now, why is that? If the main thing in the economy is human capacities, our own strength, intelligence, and ability to work together, it's hard to see how you can escape the taxation. Because suppose, think about myself, what do? I network with a lot of people. I have many co-authors, and that's how I work. I couldn't work without them. I can't go someplace else. I basically have to do with, and besides, if I went someplace else, I would have to leave my family and so on. I can send my wealth to some other country if I'm afraid it's going to be taxed. In a society in which really counts is my own abilities and networks, it's harder to send it someplace else. You can't really escape the taxation as easily. But there's another point also. In the weightless economy, it's very hard to get people to do a good job because you cannot really force it out of them. You can't coerce a good job in caring for the elderly, or teaching kids, or providing science. These are things people have to believe in. They have to have some kind of intrinsic motivation to do this stuff. And typically, you cannot get people to want to do that if they're being treated very unequally in the process. It's very hard to, for example, get good science out of people or good teaching simply by the threat of being fired or something of the nature. Finally, the reproducibility condition, which I again have reproduced at the top of the slide. There are many areas of our society, I just mentioned some of them, in which we can't really contract to get a person to do a good job. In those areas, social norms are really important, intrinsic motivation. But it's very hard to sustain these in highly unequal societies. And so it's possible that the more unequal the society, the worse they're going to do in terms of competing with other societies, because they just can't get a job well done if you can't extract it at by threat. Now, in the past, we had a very unusual system of so-called ex-ante insurance. Owners of large capital took a lot of risks. They innovated and they invested. And so there was a class of people doing that. They were wealthy enough that they didn't really care much about the downside risks, and they could afford to do it. Now think about the society we now have. Some people have said we're basically now in a society of knowledge hunters. I like the analogy because it harkens back to hunters and gatherers. Everybody has to be counted on in that society because we don't know where the next good idea is coming from. We can't afford to have a society in which 10% or maybe 5% of the society has the wealth which makes it possible for them to innovate. Because we've all got to be involved in the innovation process for the simple reason that I don't know if you're going to be the one who comes up with a great idea, or you, or maybe even me. I've experienced that in my life. I don't even know which of my ideas are good ideas until long after I've worked for maybe a decade on them. So, and the last point is turning ideas and knowledge into property. So it's like cows and land and can be inherited and so on, will prevent the use of the knowledge, which is essential to the economy. Because what are intellectual property rights? It's creating a monopoly, deliberately creating a monopoly, so that this person has this stuff, and then they can charge a high price. Well, if they charge a high price, what does that mean? It means it's not widely used. Those of you in economics know what a public good is. A public good is something which if I have more, you don't have less. Information is a public good. If you ask me the time of day, and I say it's 5 minutes to 5, I don't lose that knowledge by telling you, right? So knowledge has that capacity to be shared by everybody. Turning it into something which is like a cow or a piece of land in which I can exclude you, obviously is a pretty dumb way to organize a society. Societies who do that, the US is pushing it very hard right now, will probably do less well in the future in competition with other societies. So again, I think the reproducibility condition may not hold in the future. So here's the argument so far, very briefly. Farming and later despotic states provided novel conditions favoring inequality. The economic condition was that forms of wealth became really important that could be inherited and monopolized. Politically, those property rights were sufficiently secure, and the taxation of those assets was sufficiently limited so that the rich actually, that the wealthy got to have a lot of income. And finally, countries that were organized that way did pretty well in competition with the rest of the world. Now, my speculation, and it's only a conjecture, is that the weightless economy, under a democratic system of government, is unlikely to provide these conditions, at least not to the extent that they were provided in the past. So this is a hopeful sense that the future into which we are now entering is one in which there's a chance that we could actually take a turn towards greater equality. Now, these are the basic ideas that I want to get across to you in the time that I have. And I'm putting them first because I want you to know where we're going in case I don't get to do the whole thing. The first is very simple. There are biological and economic limits to how much inequalities we can have in human capacities. Somebody can be 1,000 times richer than somebody else. A person cannot be 1,000 times stronger than somebody else because the person who's that weak is not a human being. They passed away, unfortunately. They're a former human being or probably never even were one. Biological differences are limited. We're also limited in how much knowledge we can use and get. PhD students, some of them haven't learned this. They think that you can spend your entire life getting your PhD, but sometimes their advisors have to tell them, no, at some point, you actually have to get your PhD and go and use it before you die. So there's an obvious limit to how much, because of the finiteness of our life, there's a limit to how much knowledge any person can get. There's no limit to how many cows I can own. No limit at all. In the data sets that I work with, you'll find somebody with 1,000 cows. And somebody else has 2 or 3. You don't find that with these with human wealth. Secondly, as I've already said, it's hard to pass this stuff on. I don't know what it is that I have that's made it possible for me. I feel extremely grateful that I've been able to be a teacher all of my life. I don't know what it is that gives me that, but it's not something I could pass on to my kids. By the way, I'm very proud to say my daughter graduated from this university. And she's not a teacher, and she doesn't do what I do at all. But she got a very good education here, I have to say. Now, I think that individually held material wealth, I mean factories and offices and buildings and equipment and so on, is likely to become less important in the future. If the stuff that's unequally held becomes less important, and the stuff that's equally held becomes more important, that means we're going to have more equality, or at least we can have more equality. And finally, I think, remember I mentioned the cost of egalitarian redistribution, the fact that the rich have ways of fighting back against taxation because they can leave. That's also going to be less true in the future, because those who are very successful, for them to leave, it means they have to leave themselves. They have to go someplace else, learn a new culture, and so on, the argument that I mentioned. So I'll provide a little model of how this works, but I want to give some data which would suggest how we might have a more equal future. So the Lorenz curve is a way we measure inequality. And I'll explain this, because I'm going to use this again and again. We array the population along this axis from the poorest. This is the 20% who are the poorest in the population. And here we array how much income they have. So for example, here's 20% of the population, and the blue line says, oh, they have 20% of the income. So you can see the blue line is a line which indicates complete equality. This red line is actually estimated. I'll show you what I estimated it from in just a minute. The red line says, oh, well, the 20% here, the poorest 20%, they get about, what, 5% or 3%. So the extent to which this line sags down below the blue line is a measure of inequality. And we have a way of measuring it. It's called the Gini coefficient, named after the person who claimed that he invented it. I don't think he did, actually. So that's the area A, the area how much this thing sags down. A over A plus B. That's the Gini coefficient. And that's our measure. It ranges from 0, obviously. If the red line coincided with the blue line, then you wouldn't have any A, and so the thing would be 0. And if nobody had anything except the last guy here, then it would be 1. So 1 means maximum inequality. Now let's see what we've found out about the past. Well, the first thing that's interesting here is this is wealth inequality. The vertical axis is the Gini coefficient, and here we have. And it's a little hard for you to believe this, but this means 9,000 BC. That's the present up there. I actually have data now on 23,000 years ago, wealth inequality estimated from then, these are places around the world. What's interesting here, and what I want to point out, is the red dots are all societies that did not have states. What's a state? A state, meaning government, a state is a body that has a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence in the society. That's how we define the government. Doesn't sound very nice, right? But that's basically how you define a government. A government can lock you up, can take your life, and so on. Nobody else can legitimately do that. So the thing you notice is these early societies here were mostly without states. And they're pretty equal by comparison to what happened later. So obviously we have a lot more data in the present. And there seems to be an upward trend, although the next slide will show you there's not much of a trend in the last 1,000 years. You look at the United States over here, it's very unequal in wealth, and there are other societies here. Now we could talk about this the whole time, but let me go to the next slide. This is Europe for the last 700 years, so it's just Europe. There's some little trends here. You can see that inequality fell during this period quite dramatically. It probably fell because of the bubonic plague. That is, the so-called Black Plague eliminated about a third of the population in many parts of Europe. And what that meant was labor was scarce. Labor being scarce was good for people who are poor, because what they do is they labor, right? So the scarcity of labor led to an increase in wages, and that probably accounts for this decline here. I draw your attention to that number there. That's Sweden. It's one of the most unequal wealth distributions in the world. Sweden is thought of as being a very egalitarian country. By the way, I studied that in great detail. I didn't believe it when I first saw it. It's based actually on 15 different estimates and many, many conversations with Stat Sweden, the Swedish tax and stats authorities. So I'm quite sure it's true. We'll come back to that. Now, if you see a bunch of data like that, the first thing you should do is think, wow, all those Gini coefficients estimated, and some of them are estimated on one kind of thing, and some of them are from tax records, and some of them are from... So here's what we have. A lot of the early ones are from burials. In the past, people buried a significant fraction of their wealth with them, and we have very good evidence on how much wealth is in the grave of individuals. So we estimate wealth inequality on that basis. We have land records, we have inheritance, and so on. Obviously, we can't compare them directly. We have to think about the wealth type. For example, the stuff that's put in the grave is much more unequally distributed than, for example, the size of houses that people live in. We know that because we have some data points in which we have both the house inequality and the grave inequality, and we can see in the same society, oh, well, if you're measuring it by that method, graves, then you're going to get a higher estimate than if you're measuring it by houses. So, in case you wondered, this is a decade-long project involving a very large team of people, so that we could actually look at each of these data points and make these comparisons. We also have to think about population size. Some of the early data points are actually very small populations. Some of the later ones are entire nation states, and so on. This just shows you how you go from a series of data on grave wealth among Northwest Coast Native Americans, actually British Columbians, to the actual estimate, and I think I'll pass on the details. But I think this is the best data for comparability that you can have over a very long period. Here's what you find out. Probably if I shouldn't have put this up here. Suppose I asked you, what do you think the differences are in the wealth? How do you explain them? If you'd asked me, I would say, oh, it's probably because of the institutions that they have. We already saw that the states seem to be, that once we had governments, got a lot more inequality, so maybe the non-state dimension would be important. Well, here's what I found out. I made these categories. These are democratic capitalist societies. That's modern, late 20th century, or even some early 20th century, European, American, and some others. These are the city-states of both Germany and Italy and other places. These are national states. That is, they're formed like a nation state, but they're undemocratic. Autocratic states are earlier, and then these are the non-states. What I get from this is that the slave societies are more unequal. And that's one big piece of information here. Now, when I thought about that, we said, well, yeah, obviously, I mean, we know everything we know about the history of those societies is that they're unequal. But you know, that tells you a little more than that. In a slave society, labor itself, that is, human capacities, were owned, just like cows were owned or land, and you could inherit your slaves. So labor itself became like material wealth, inheritable, monopolizable, and so on. That may be one of the reasons why we have these slave states being so unequal. And I've already mentioned that the non-state places are less less unequal. This is the model I mentioned. I won't be using the Greek symbols, but I want you to think about it causally. An arrow means causes. So we're trying to explain inequality in well-being, like income inequality or inequality in whatever it is that the society values. And that's explained by how unequal the wealth is. Wealth is stuff that you own. It's also redistribution, taxes, and so on. And it also here depends on how important is the material wealth in actually producing your income. Well, then we have to understand wealth inequality, and that's going to be that results from wealth shocks and intergenerational wealth transmission. Let's think about what a shock is. A shock is something that happens and somebody steals your cattle, or you have a very serious illness, or you have a genetic problem, or you get a very good job because you happen to have the right skill at the right time. That's every generation, every period that's putting more inequality in the system. But it's also true that it matters the extent to which the inequalities of the last generation are going to be actually experienced by today's generation. And that's just inheritance. Suppose your grandfather was really lucky and he ends up with a lot of land. Well, you'll probably have a lot of land too. So it's the inheritance of one generation's inequality accumulating through generations. And so those two things, and that's why we had these two areas, the shocks matter, and intergenerational wealth transmission. Transmission just means inheritance. How similar are the offspring to the parents when it comes to wealth? Now, let's think about the human differences. We're pretty different, right? If you look around, you do notice a lot of human differences. But I've already said there are biological limits to how different we can be. So let's think about inequality in something which would be related to human strength or capacities. What I happen to have is measures of height. And we'll go to Kenya and study the Kipsigis population. They're herders. This is Monique Borgerhoff-Mulder, who's an anthropologist and a co-author with me on many projects. Those of you who are doing social science of some kind, I want you to think about how to study inequality. You start with data. You start with numbers. Literally, these IDs are people. We know their names. She knows all of them personally, by the way. She speaks Swahili, of course, and she's been going there for 25 years. So then this is the number of cattle that they have. Well, with those data, you can then calculate a Lorenz curve. That's actually the very same Lorenz curve that I just showed you because I just moved it around the slides. And for the Kipsigis people, the Lorenz curve gives us a Gini coefficient of roughly 0.6. That's a lot of inequality. And so we estimate cow inequality for them. In that way. And we do that for every society we come to. We take raw data and we make a Lorenz curve and we calculate the Gini coefficient. Now think about this. What do you think the Lorenz curve for height is going to look like? You think, what's that? Inequality in height? Yeah, sure. You have the shortest person and the next shortest and so on. What fraction of the total height of the population does the shortest 10% have? And so on. Okay, have you formed in your mind what that Lorenz curve is going to look like? There it is. Yeah, what? That's it. That's the Lorenz curve. That little gray area, that's the A part. That's the inequality. And the Gini coefficient is 0.02. Remember, for cows, it was 0.6. And for height, it's 0.02. So now, among the Kipsigis people, comparisons of this type would not be unusual. So what's going on here? We know we're very different in height. This is actually the distribution of height among the Kipsigis people. It looks sort of like a normal distribution. The reason why there's very little inequality in height is because everybody has a lot of height. We don't have people, who are shorter than, say, 130 centimeters. You don't have them. They don't reproduce. There are a few, but very, very few. So here we have a comparison between a human capacity, or something about our bodies, which is height, which is very equal, and cows, which is the opposite. Now, when we go on to studying why some societies are more unequal than others, we're not only interested in how unequal the assets can be, like cows or height, we're interested in well, do these things get passed on? So now we're going to study this measure of transmission intergenerationally, inheritance. And so we're going to use data like this. This is the mother's social status. It's obviously a normalized variable with a mean 0 and a unit standard deviation. And this is the daughter's status. And the solid ones, the daughter, when the daughter was growing up, the mom was around, and the open ones, the mom wasn't around. And as you can see, there's a lot of transmission there. The high status moms have high status daughters. Now, unfortunately, these data are for the African spotted hyena. They're not for humans, but you can see the African spotted hyenas are really, really good at passing on status. It's passed on in the females, and the females are extremely status conscious, and they manage to do a pretty good job of doing it. But we can't use data like this. We have to do the hard work of looking at wills. This is a will from Toscana, where I teach in Italy, and we have to study who was passing on what to whom. That's the kind of data we have. Now, so let's think about how much our cows passed on, and I'm going to compare that. That's up top here. This is a group of herders called the Datoga, also in East Africa, very close to the Kipsigis, but not the same tribe. And here we have the son's cows and the dad's cows here. So you can see there's a positive relationship between the two. What is called RS, reproductive success, is how many kids you have that survive to age 5. So that's a measure of passing on a form of wealth, because in that society, having a lot of kids is a very valuable thing. And what you notice there in the bottom graph is it's not passed on at all. The success, I mean, these parents here would have been regarded with great admiration in their society because they had a lot of kids, but their kids didn't have a lot of kids. So once again, I think you're seeing the picture. That is, stuff that's material gets passed on, so inequalities accumulate. And stuff that has to do with human society or human biology is much less likely to have that characteristic. And I'm just reminding you there that that beta is just the percentage difference in offspring wealth associated with the 1% difference in parental wealth. So now, again, why are cattle inherited but reproductive success is not? Well, I've suggested. Let's compare these. This is land. This is a hunter in among the Aceh people. And this is, you see the eyeglasses? Eyeglasses are because it's supposed to be a beta there. And the font didn't translate. But it's okay. It's just math, okay? It's a symbolic language, so when you see eyeglasses, just think beta. So hunting ability, we measure how good the person is as a hunter, the father and the son. It's obviously very, very detailed studies to do this. And it's passed on, 0.08. Social networks is how many people you have connections with. You ask how many people you share food with or how many people you jointly hunt with, and so on. Reproductive success again. Grip strength is just a measure of the forearm strength, and it's correlated with other kinds of upper body strength. The fact that that's negative, that star says it's not statistically significant. That is, this basically is a 0. So this shows that these human things don't get passed on very much. So this guy here, who in fact is a very good hunter, his son or daughter would not be. Not particularly so. Now look at this. Remember, that's a beta there. Livestock, land. So this is camels, and these are all cattle and land. And look at the difference. Huge amounts of transmission. What this says here, for example, is if the father was 10% above the mean, the son will be about 5% above the mean. And these are to be compared with this. What this says is, the take-home message is, the inheritance of material wealth is much greater than the inheritance of capacities and networks. Now let's think about technology. Just to remind you, we've now studied this part of the picture here, shocks and this transmission. Now let's look at certain kinds of wealth being more important than others. I'm going to dramatize the difference by saying, well, suppose there's some kind of wealth that's equally held. That's like, suppose we're, like I discovered in India, well, everybody has basically the same kind of capacities, but then people have different kinds of land and so on. And alpha is what we're going to use as a measure of how important the material stuff is that can be unequally held. Now, here's an interesting fact, and it really, when I studied these people in the Northwest Coast Indians, I really learned something. These are hunters and gatherers, and yet they're extraordinarily unequal. Well, what's that about? We know hunters and gatherers are very equal. Well, what it's about, by the way, this is an early photograph of the daughter of a chief, and these are depictions of slaves. So this is a society of hunters and gatherers who have slaves. That's not the usual picture. Hunters and gatherers are very egalitarian. So what's the story? Well, the story is these places here. The fishing sites in the middle of the river are extremely valuable, and they're very small. They can be defended. So this technology here, there was something really important, namely that fishing site. And a lineage, that's an extended family roughly, a lineage which would live in a longhouse, and we could identify who lived there. We know that these two guys here had access to those sites for 1,400 years. That is, the people who lived in this site here were catching the fish that could only be caught in the center of the river. And the other longhouses were catching fish that you could only catch from the side of the river. And so now, form in your mind, what's the inequality going to look like in this group of hunters and gatherers? Well, there it is. This is from their wealth, the stuff they put in the ground. Now what this says here, notice the Lorenz curve is flat here. It means half the population didn't have any wealth at all. At least they didn't bury any. And these other are two different measures. And so you look and you see that, well, the Gini coefficient for these hunters and gatherers was 0.7. Now, the key to this is that it doesn't matter whether you're a hunter and gatherer. What matters is, do you have something that's small enough to defend and valuable enough to actually fence and actually, take up arms to defend it? I want to teach you a way of thinking about technology. This is called a simplex, this triangle. Consider some point in it. Its coordinates of that point sum to 1. So, for example, if the point was over here, all that would matter was material wealth. This distance here is how important embodied wealth is. And that distance there is how important material wealth is. That's the alpha that I used before. So, for example, a society which is up here means all that matters is your strength and your networks. Material wealth doesn't matter. And so what we did, my research team and me, is we took a bunch of societies. They're represented by the triangles and so on in this shape. And we said, well, okay, we got assessments from the ethnographers. How important are the various kinds of wealth in your society? This here, for example, is a society in which, according to the ethnographer, having material wealth was completely unimportant. What mattered was network wealth and embodied wealth. And these circles and triangles are hunter-gatherers and what's called horticulture. Horticulture is sometimes called garden farming. It's farming where you have a very unlimited supply of land. You just go cut down some trees and plant stuff, sometimes called slash and burn. It allows you essentially to have land if you want it. So land isn't scarce. And again, in the horticultural societies, what's scarce is your labor, your ability to farm, how good you are at farming. So what you notice here is that up here, you have the hunter-gatherers and the horticultural societies. This is where labor matters, the labor of hunting or labor of farming. Over here, what matters is cows and land. So essentially, we can think about technologies as differing across societies according to how important material wealth is. So we did another look at our data, our historical data, and here I did this with Amy Bogard, who's a fantastic anthropologist at Oxford University. And here, the red dots are all societies in which, from what we could tell by studying their agriculture, Land wasn't scarce. What was scarce was labor. All the other dots are places where land had become scarce. The big change, by the way, was the blue dots were places where they'd gotten oxen and ox teams. Once you got ox teams, essentially, you could farm a whole lot of land, and so land became scarce because they started to use a lot of land. And once again, it looks like the story that I'm telling is true. There's an upward trend in both cases, but the red dots, the places where labor matters, are much more equal than the blue dots where land matters. We're still working on that. Now let's come back to this is just to repeat the conjecture that I said. Basically, I think the key to a more egalitarian future is that we may be moving into an economy in which material wealth isn't that important. And the stuff that does matter is hard to accumulate, hard to monopolize, and easy to tax. So that's the idea. Now, this is a summary of what I've said, and I think in the interest of having a little time for question, and because I'm sure you basically have the idea, I've repeated myself a bit, this is the main point. The weightless economy of the future may recover some of the foundations of hunter-gatherer equality, which we experienced prior to the Neolithic Revolution. The Neolithic Revolution taking place from approximately 11,000 years ago. Now, of course, I'm not sure this is going to happen. There's some things working on the other direction. For example, in many kinds of information production, there are huge economies of scale. For example, consider a book. You produce a book, it's a huge cost getting the first copy of the book. The marginal cost of additional copies is very little. When you have economies of scale, you may get winner-take-all competition. It's things like conflicts between networks and things of that nature. Usually there's one big winner at the end of the day. You don't have a lot of competitors in that. It's also true that intellectual property rights, if they're imposed and enforced, create a kind of monopoly which is harder to break even than the kinds of monopolies we had in my youth, where we had the oil companies and the car companies and the chemical companies, of which there were three dominant ones, or four or two, because intellectual property rights, those big companies, some other big company could come in and start producing cars. They could do it. If I have an intellectual property right, there's no way you can use it unless I give it to you or rent it to you. It's just, sorry, you just can't have it. There's no way you can compete with me. So I want to come back to technology, institutions, and the future of wealth inequality. Here's a story about the Tandroy people at the top in Madagascar. You can see they're herders. You remember from the Kipsigis that herders tend to be very unequal. In many herding populations, when an elder dies, an elite elder who owns many cattle dies, they have a funeral service, and the whole community comes. What do you think they eat? They eat the cows they eat from the herd of the deceased elite member. In this particular society, the immediate family of the deceased do not get to eat from those cows, but the whole community eats from the cows. But, okay, now that you've got that, here's one I want you to really think about. How long does the feast go on? Think of the craziest answer you can think of, and it's true. Okay, it goes on until all the cows have been eaten. That's the truth. Did I put the... No, I didn't put... I thought this was so crazy when I read it. I actually had to go ask people. I had to get in touch with this person. Yes, they eat all the cows. It takes months in some cases, just feasting. Now, it's a pretty stupid way to distribute income. I mean, 100% taxation, inheritance tax, right? 100% inheritance tax, but you have to eat it on the spot. I mean, maybe they should just get a fridge, and then let people have it, but that's not what they do. Now, I'm sure if you ask the Tandroy people, why do you do this? They wouldn't say, well, we do this because we're egalitarian. Not at all. They would say, we do this because grandpa, has to be properly cared for, and so on. But the fact is, these people have decided on a practice which is hugely egalitarian. Now, let's think about it. The people of Denmark are a little bit like the Tandroy. They just don't tolerate a lot of inequality in their society. And in fact, the people of Denmark, I've held up hunters and gatherers as being, with some exceptions, the paragons of equality. But the correlation between fathers' incomes and sons' incomes in Denmark is as low as the correlation in hunter-gatherer societies between their forms of wealth. It's really amazing. Denmark is as equal as the hunter-gatherer societies in our data sets. Now, of course, there are other societies in the modern world, like the United States, that are even more unequal than the most unequal herding societies and farming societies. But that should teach us a lesson, because Denmark and Finland are operating in the same world economy, facing the same competition as the United States and the UK, which are very unequal countries. They have the same knowledge. We have the same technology. And one set of countries, the so-called Nordic countries, has equality at a level that we haven't experienced in human history. I mean, equal to the most equal societies we've ever seen. And we have the other societies in the same economic circumstances generating huge amounts of inequality. And so I think this is, I would like you to think of economic inequality is policy. It's a choice. It's dictated by unequal politics, unequal power in society. It's not destiny, which is made inevitable by human differences or perhaps by technology or the dictates of efficiency. That's what I think I've learned from this process. I'd like to thank all of my co-authors, of which there are a great many, as you can see. That's a group of my co-authors there, as you can see. And I thank you very much for your attention.
So if you'd like to ask a question, it's probably going to be the best to form a line. And we can just go through the line here so everyone can hear.
A question or a comment. You don't have to put a question mark at the end of it if you want to say how wrong you think I am. Uh-oh, I think that's what you have on your mind, right? Why don't you turn around and say they can, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. That was fascinating and reminds me of one of my favorite talks that I went to, which is by David Graeber and David something else, Wenger, I think, an archaeologist, and kind of came to very similar conclusions that more egalitarian tribal societies have formulated egalitarian institutions more or less intentionally, even if they wouldn't respond to the question that way. I have a question about this concept of the future weightless economy. So myself and some others in the room here at University of Vermont study ecological economics. And one of the major sort of findings of our discipline is that a weightless economy can only exist on top of a very weighty economy. And once that weightless economy comes into existence, it doesn't mean that we no longer need food and capital and just the means of production, which continue to be privately owned. So I'm wondering if having a weightless economy, having just a big service sector on top of that material economy, or complementing it, you might say, if that changes the dynamics, if that's part of your optimism for the future of inequality.
Thanks for the question. By the way, that's a hard question, and those of you who are here are in a very fortunate position. If you want to try to answer questions like this, you happen to have found yourself in the right place, because the economics department of the University of Vermont has a very large number of people who are interested in exactly the kinds of questions we're talking about and have established a research record on various aspects of inequality. So it's something that's on their minds, and they can help you in trying to understand more about this. I think that the weightful economy, whatever that thing isn't weightless. I mean, what we're observing is that if just look at the fraction of people in our society involved in, say, manufacturing, it's very small. It's less than 20%. Germany is the real hero in terms of manufacturing, producing things, and it's about 18%. The fraction of the society engaged in manufacturing is declining even in Korea, which is very successful in manufacturing. So most of what people are doing is not producing stuff. But as you say, we still have to have stuff to wear, and we have to eat, and we drive around in things, and so on. But the fact is, the process of technical change, that is improving the capacity to produce the things that we have with very little labor and very little capital, has gone to such an extent that not much of the economy is engaged in doing it. As somebody said, it still takes just as long to, say, play a concerto, a particular concerto, as it ever did, but it takes much, much less time, 1/20th perhaps, to produce a shirt or something like that. So when I say that the weightless part of the economy is increasing in size, what I mean is that more people are engaged in that, and the success of an economy is increasingly going to be judged by not how good we are at producing things, but how good we are at treating each other in all the ways that I said. I think my view of the weightless economy may be a little bit optimistic because, of course, with the modern technology, the capabilities for actually doing surveillance of what people are doing is really extraordinary. So, I mean, I'm sure you've heard about the things that came in 20 years ago. Long-haul truck drivers, for example, now are extremely closely monitored for their speeds, for their stops, for anything, and that's easy to do because you just have to. It's called I forget the name of the device, but so there are ways that you can be observed now, and therefore your pace of work and your activities can be more carefully measured. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think that really is going to substitute for it. I worked for a while as a metal worker, that is a lathe operator, and I had a rack of pipes over here, and I had to drill a couple of holes in them and then put them in another rack over there. And anybody could count how many I did and how many I screwed up. Now, that's just not the case when you're taking care of kids in a daycare or when you're waiting on table in a restaurant. So I do think that the weightless economy is distinctive and it's growing in importance. That's not the case in the poor countries in the world, where material production is still extremely important and the service sector is small.
So I just, at the beginning you mentioned Sweden, and I was a little bit curious as to what the elaboration on that was.
Okay.
It was one of the most unequal countries in the world when it is generally believed to be a more egalitarian society.
That's a great question. The answer to the question is we have to distinguish between wealth, which is a stock, and income, which is a flow. Think of a bathtub. The stuff flowing in is like income. That's something per unit of time, so many gallons a minute or something. The stuff in the tub is so many gallons with no time dimension. So what's unequal in Sweden is the stock, that is the wealth. That means ownership of factories and so on is extremely unequal there. Now, how do they have such an equal lifestyle? It's because of the tax rates. I mean, huge taxes. The Swedish economy has been extraordinarily successful in sustaining a very high living standard on the average, and much higher wages than in America. They do this in a society in which they allow tremendous wealth to be accumulated through actually quite innovative business practices and so on. And then they tax it heavily. Sweden and the other so-called Nordic countries is something you might want to study because they combine the dynamism and the tendency towards innovation of a capitalist economy with a kind of social solidarity of an ideal socialist economy, and it works. Now, it doesn't work, it doesn't mean it hasn't been transplanted everywhere, but in the countries I've mentioned, it works extraordinarily well as a model.
I think that some of my students here would be interested in what their pressure points are and what we should be working on if we are concerned about long-run inequality.
Well, I think, as you know, I think the question of intellectual property rights is absolutely central to the future of equality and inequality. And I think the cause of making sure that knowledge is a public good and freely available is absolutely essential. The textbook that Bill mentioned at the beginning, by the way, that's produced by a group of about 25 economists from around the world. None of us have been paid 1 penny, and this book, which is 1,000 pages long at least, is free online. I don't know how much you paid for your economics textbook, but we're not charging a penny for this. It's also been produced as a conventional book by a university press, and it's being sold at some small price. But the fact is, you can get it on your telephone. If you want to find it right now, core-econ.org. It's a fantastic introduction to economics, and I hope there'll be people here at the University of Vermont interested in trying. Well, I think, Elaine, you've tried it, haven't you? You've used it, yeah. I think that is an area that I think we can do something about. I think the other area that is, as you asked for pressure points, so the reason why that's a pressure point is intellectual property rights are really a dumb way to organize the process of innovation and diffusion of knowledge. The argument that they encourage innovation is apparently false, and that's because patents are used as often to block other people from innovating as they are as a motivation for innovating. Now, I mean, it differs from industry to industry. It may be that, for example, in pharmaceuticals, there's a case for something like patents, but in general, what economists thought was true in the past, which is we would find lots of evidence that these things really spur innovation, that evidence has not been forthcoming. And I don't think it's going to come forth either, because anybody who wanted to get tenure immediately in economics would get tenure if they could show convincingly that patents and copyrights spurred innovation. They, right to the top. So everybody would like to do that, and so that's the first thing. But the main thing about patents is they prevent other people from using something which should be available at zero cost. One of the things, if you know a little bit of economics, you know that the reason why the economy works sometimes like Adam Smith's invisible hand said it should is because the price of a good is equal to its marginal cost. That's the way it's supposed to work. Well, the marginal cost of a book is zero, essentially. I mean, it's just the cost of the paper and so on. It's probably about $7 or $8 for example, my most recent book, which is now selling at a university press for some vast sum, like $40. That's why we just decided to put it online free. It should be free. Of course, we have a problem, which is how to survive as an organization. But we'll, because we're spending a fair amount of money producing this. Have a look at it. It's really interesting stuff. core-econ.org.
So I'm really thinking out loud here, but you mentioned how rich people can fight redistribution by threatening to go elsewhere if you tax them too much. And I think they have a lot of other ways of fighting against that too, lobbying and various kinds of power. So do you think that the weightless economy will somehow just get around that? Or will the economy grow so much that we all have loads of money anyway? Or how will that work?
No, I don't think the weightless economy is going to solve that problem, and thank you for reminding me that. I was going to go on to say a couple of other pressure points. That's a pressure point. Democratizing the U.S. government would be a really important task. It's extraordinary the extent to which we've become accustomed to the fact that our system is really very undemocratic in terms of how elections are financed, the attempts to get people to not vote, and so on and so on. So, when I think of the fact, if you had told me, 60 years ago or 40 years ago, that I would be wanting that everybody should champion the cause of making America a democratic society, I would say, what planet are you on? Of course, of course there was problems of African Americans not voting and a lot of problems in the past, and they got successively dealt with, kind of, and I thought, well, it's going to continue. So I would say, the last point, and when I said maybe my optimism isn't true, is not one I mentioned, but it's not obvious that democratic governance will survive. And that's something we have to have really front and center. And the third thing, getting back to Elaine's question about pressure points, I think there are lots of issues about justice concerning the environment. This is not only international, but also domestic. And once again, it's a pressure point because people already accept the fact that governments have to be involved in dealing with the environment. There are some people who still deny that, but that's a pretty easy argument to win. So we're going to have the environment will be politicized. Well, if it's politicized, there's a fair chance that you're going to get a more just outcome, because people really have a hard time defending entirely selfish projects in the public sphere. I mean, the thing about capitalism that makes it so amenable to inequality is that the inequality happens almost magically. It happens because of buying and selling stuff, and nobody's really imposing it. That level of inequality, which was, if it were achieved on political grounds, would really be quite unacceptable. So I think the fact that we're going to politicize the environment, because we have to, is now getting a subject on the table in which I think the forces of social justice and greater equality could actually score some big victories. I mean, obviously the current climate in America is, I'm not talking about the next year or the next 5 years, but I am talking about sometime during my lifetime, which is, I don't know how long, but it's not 100 years. It's, we're talking decades here, and I think there's going to be some big changes in the kinds of direction that I'm talking.
I want to ask some question about the weightless economy. So it seems like for the more ancient time, when you have the hunter-gatherers, the human ability will make some difference. Okay? But the difference in the material goods will not be so tremendous.
Exactly.
But for nowadays, if some people have some new invention, the invention will make a huge difference, right, in the production of material goods, right? Someone who has invented the computer can really revolutionize, right, the way that we organize our life, the way that we produce things. So that therefore, even though human capacity in themselves might not differ so much, but the impacts, right, their invention can really have huge impacts on efficiency on production of goods. So that is why I think that might still make it the case that the inequality will continue because of the such a big gap in the inequality of the impact of the invention.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I'm not sure your conclusion is right, but I want to make clear that the basic argument is that a lot of inequality happens because somebody is advantageously positioned or they have a good idea, and then they do something, and that's hugely beneficial, and along with being hugely beneficial, it's hugely profitable until other people copy that person, and then you lose your special status. Now, that process is why capitalism is such an innovative system. And capitalism has been extraordinarily innovative. It's accounted for unprecedented increases in material living standards in the last 200 years. And it's partly because of that. But that also generates a lot of inequality because the person who gets there first gets a lot of... Now, what I don't know to be the case is I don't know that the present and the future is really different from the past. The people who innovated in the past also made huge profits before they got competed with by everybody else. People say the pace of technical change is speeding up. I don't think there's any evidence for that. Certainly the productivity is not speeding up, and maybe it's unmeasured output or something, but I think that capitalism has always been innovative. It's always had this capacity to confer upon the ones who are innovators, the first there, these big prizes, and that's, by the way, a kind of inequality which you can see has some purpose to it if it's really a basis for the innovation. The important thing is they shouldn't keep it for too long, and that's why we shouldn't have patents and copyrights and so on. The Industrial Revolution, by the way, took place in many places entirely without effective intellectual property rights. So this tremendous upsurge in creativity and innovation was not stimulated primarily by searching for the gains you can make because of your intellectual property rights.
I would like to abuse my position here and ask you a question, Sam, if you don't mind. No one else wants to take the mic. So most economists believe strongly in incentives, yet this has largely been a talk that doesn't look at incentives at all. And in fact, if we look at the innovation with respect to the weightless economy, we're going to somehow have this innovation without incentives. Now, one thing that, for example, Jaffe and Lerner, who look at this question quite empirically, quite well. What they recommend in their study of patents is that perhaps we move to a system of prizes. Prizes allow the incentives to be there, but at the same time allow the production process to move to marginal cost pricing almost immediately. And so in a sense, it solves both problems. One which you have not talked too much about, which is incentives, and the other is the bloated costs of the patent system.
Prizes are really great. I mean, you understand, suppose there's some sickness, sleeping sickness in Africa, for example, and then you can specify, we want a treatment of this which can cost less than this, can be administered by people who are illiterate, and can be transported without refrigeration. You have a long list of specs. And then you say, whoever gets this gets a huge prize, $1 billion, whatever. But once you get your $1 billion, that's it. There are no intellectual property rights in this. And these little pills can be produced by any factory, so they're going to, they'll cost, $10 for a treatment, or maybe 10 cents. That's the idea. It's a great idea. It's been around for a long time, by the way, 300 or 400 years. It doesn't work where you don't have a specification of what it is the output is going to be. So it works for some things. It doesn't work for the kind of work that I do because, for example, if you said, well, we're going to pay you if you discover something really great about this, I don't really know what I'm discovering. It's always I look back and say, oh, well, that turned out to be pretty interesting. So a lot of work can't be managed with prizes, but a lot of it can. Here's an interesting thing. Among the Aceh people, remember the guy with the bow and arrow? That guy, his people, men hunt and women both dig and collect fruit and other things. And when and a friend of mine studied in great detail, well, who actually killed that animal and who dug up these tubers and so on. Very detailed account of who got the stuff. And then you can imagine a matrix. You have all these, all these names here and what they got, and then who ate the thing. So you have, who got these tubers and who ate the tubers for everything they got over a long period of time. And there is no relationship between who got it and who ate it. It differs a little bit, but by calories, over 2/3 of the calories acquired by people was actually eaten by somebody who was not part of the immediate family. And it's typically the case that the hunter himself, it's always a him if it's a hunter, the hunter himself cannot eat the stuff that he catches. So that's the norm. Now, on the other hand, some kinds of fruits you can take home and eat with your family. This is all about incentives. So males who are going through the forest will pass by the rich place for tubers or fruit. They won't touch them. They could harvest them and take them home and share them with their family. They don't do it. They may send somebody back to tell the women to get them and they can take them home and so on. They don't do it themselves. But ask yourself, where's the incentive? Why do the hunters hunt? Because if you catch something, you can't eat it. And besides, it's mostly going to go, if it's a large package like meat or, for that matter, honey, it goes to everybody. Now, it's a very interesting question. They're hunting because there's a lot of status attached to being a good hunter, and people want that respect. It's thought, but not very well established, that in that tribe, the hunters have more children. It's not actually very convincing whether it's true or not, but it's basically status. I hunted with people called the Hadza people in Tanzania, and don't worry, we didn't kill anything, but we did find a massive amount of honey. And we were a band of about 12 people. I was not part of the band, but I was hunting with them. There was 3 of us hunting, and there were some other people back at the camp. And we brought this stuff back, and it was just, I thought, what's going to happen to this? The stuff disappeared by nightfall, and how it disappeared was a couple of teenage kids were sent. They went all over the place, getting other groups who had nothing to do with this, and saying, come on over, we're having a honey party. And it was gone by nightfall. Now, that's how they work. Now, of course, this particular group and the particular 3 people who brought the honey back, they got a lot of status from that. Now, if you study, for example, the production of open source software, or a lot of other things in the weightless economy, it's kind of similar. I mean, ask yourself, why did I spend the last 5 years creating a new introduction to economics, and I didn't get paid a penny? I mean, I spent thousands of hours, I'm not exaggerating, thousands of hours, and I didn't do other stuff. And a lot of other people did too, and I don't think I'm particularly generous. I did it because I really enjoyed doing a good job, and I think people are pretty excited by the project. You know, just ask yourself. You often do things not in order to be recompensed, but not with money in any case, but to be recompensed in some way, reputationally, or maybe just some sense of satisfaction. Now, you say, well, that can't be a general human motivation. Sorry, wait a minute. Remember, the way hunter-gatherers organized their societies, that survived for 100,000 years. That's the longest surviving system of economics that has ever existed in the world. And they beat all other systems, presumably, with which they came into conflict. So it worked really well. So you can't say it's against human nature. It worked really well for a long time, and it works really well in a lot of realms of our society today, including, for example, universities. I mean, ask your professors, are they doing it for the money? No, if they were doing it for the money, they wouldn't be here. They're doing it because they enjoy it, they think it's a valuable thing to do. If they didn't get paid anything for it, they wouldn't do it. But you know, money isn't the only thing that motivates us. It's extraordinary how we are motivated by other things, and it's very